Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Zhou in Beijing. U.S. President Barack Obama's visit to Cuba marks the re-establishment of diplomatic relations after more than half a century. Efforts also underway to ease the economic sanctions that have prevented U.S. and Cuban businesses from trading with one another for so many years. What is the main drive behind the U.S. re-engagement with its neighbor, with whom it continues to differ politically? Has Chinese economic competition in Latin America made America change its Cold War ways? And how likely is it that the next U.S. president, whoever he or she is, will build on the progress started by President Obama? To talk about these and more, I'm happy to be joined by Rick Dunham, visiting scholar at Tsinghua University, and Mr. Wang Peng, Associate Research Fellow at the Institute of Latin American Studies at the China Academy of Social Sciences. But before we begin our program, let's take a look at this.
The American national anthem playing over Havana's Revolution Square, the center of power in communist Cuba. And with Che Guevara looking on, US President Barack Obama paid tribute to José Martí, the hero of Cuba's independence war against Spain. Then came the long-awaited meeting with Cuba's President Raúl Castro, a critical moment that could determine how much further this new relationship can progress. After half a century of hostilities, there are many unresolved differences on both sides. Many wondered if this would end up as a tense encounter. The body language suggested otherwise. Their discussions lasted for more than an hour. Afterwards, both leaders spoke to the press. Both address the profound differences that remain over issues from human rights to the US trade embargo, but both agreed that engagement was the best way forward.
Hoy ratifico que debemos poner en práctica.
Today I reaffirm that we should exercise the art of civilized coexistence, which involves accepting and respecting differences and preventing these from becoming the center of our relationship.
I guess ultimately what this comes down to, Andres, I have faith in people. I think that if you meet Cubans here and Cubans meet Americans and they're meeting and talking and interacting and doing business together and going to school together and learning from each other, then they'll recognize people are people. And in that context, I believe that change will occur.
We're talking about America-Cuba relations. So since 1959, when the Cuban Revolution, and then America severed all its ties with Cuba, and now American president on Cuba soil again, 88 years after the last president to do that. So what has changed and why now, Rick?
Well, why now? Because Barack Obama is a new generation of American leader. He was born in 1961, 2 years after Fidel Castro came to power. He is not a president of the Cold War era. He's a president, the first president in America really born after or come of age after the Cold War politically. And I think this is a page that he's wanted to turn. I believe when he was elected president, he had 3 pages he wanted to turn from American history. One was Cuba, one was Iran, one was North Korea. And on two of the three he succeeded, at least to a degree.
He's not the first president to reach out to Cubans. President Carter did that, President Nixon, and even President Kennedy did that. Why Mr. Obama put it through?
Well, I would say President Kennedy reached out with guns, though. I mean, there was an attempted invasion at the Bay of Pigs and then the Cuban Missile Crisis. But the difference right now is that the United States was ready and Cuba was ready. We have a different Castro in power in Cuba. Raúl Castro is the brother of Fidel Castro, but he is not Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro is the Mao of Cuba. He is the revolutionary leader. And Raúl Castro is the leader who's trying to move Cuba to the next generation. So I think that's a big difference, as well as Obama being different than the previous American presidents.
Mr. Wang, do you concur that it's a good timing for both countries to reestablish their diplomatic ties?
Yeah, I do think so. It's a very valuable time for both countries to do the same job. I think for the United States, the domestic politics is more favorable to this matter. Why? It's because in in United States, there is a very large Cuban American community. Many of them were exiled from Cuba in the 1950s and the 1960s. Those exiles were very against the Cuban government. But right now, after 50 years, many of them have been dead. Now, those Cuban Americans are their children or grandchildren. They know very few about this revolution. They don't have this hatred against the current Cuban government. So right now, they are not so against the improvement of bilateral relations. For Cuba, I think right now, as we know, this government, the Cuban government is pushing forward its economic reform. It wants to have a more favorable exterior environment. So that's why the current government would like to repair this relationship with the United States.
I want to first talk about the American situation. What is the main driver for this, for Mr. Obama? Is it because of the demographic change in Florida that he might win some political points? Is it because of the narrowing down of ideological differences? Or is it because of economic incentive? Rick?
Well, I think it's a combination of those factors. One thing you have to think of is his legacy. He's in the final year of his presidency, and he's thinking about his place in history. And he wants to move forward, not just reestablish diplomatic relations, but try to open the door so wide that the next president can't shut it. I do think there's an economic reason. There was a U.S. embargo on Cuba for 55 years. It clearly hasn't succeeded. It costs American businesses more than $1 billion a year. It did not bring the Cuban government to fall, as was the goal. And so there's really an economic incentive both for the United States and for Cuba to help build the economy. So I think it's a combination of those things.
But it seems Cuba has more economic incentives to do this. The embargo, or as the Cubans say, blockade, has hurt the Cuban economy dramatically. So the Cubans want the embargo to lift. But is it possible? Because it is still a Republican-controlled Congress in the U.S.
Yeah, I do think so. It's very hard to lift it within a short term. You know, for the Obama administration to establish this bilateral relationship, official relations, is quite hard. It's the first step, I think. For the next step, to lift the embargo, it needs to gather more political consensus to do it. Those efforts have to be supported by the Republican. So I think it's more like another step for the next administration.
But Cubans obviously think it is on their way. Do you think it is feasible that the embargoes will be lifted anytime soon?
I don't think it's feasible this year. There's no way the Republican Congress will lift the embargo. The Republican Congress, the Senate will not confirm the ambassador to Cuba. So there is not a formal U.S. ambassador to Cuba.
Yeah.
I think it would take a Democratic Senate, and it would take strong support from business interests in the United States to pressure some moderate Republicans to go along. So it's another year at least.
So this visit is more symbolic, should I say, but less substantive content.
That's right. I think it is the opening the door and trying to set a tone for the relationship. Even though the two presidents had disagreements at their press conference, they had a press conference, and as you could see, the body language seemed to be positive. So they both left their countries thinking positively about what happened during the day.
And Cuba has always been trying to improve its economic status by should I say, practicing more opening door and reform policies like what China did 30 years ago. What do you think Cuba has been doing in that front, Mr. Wang?
Yeah, I think Cuba, the government is quite flexible. The government once met with a lot of economic hardship in the 1990s. But anyway, finally it overcame it. But I think it has sensed this hardship might be repeated if there was no economic reform. Mm-hmm. So I think right now, Raúl Castro is pushing forward people to do it, to move this, push up this reform to form like a kind of new political consensus.
And will this kind of a rapprochement with its northern neighbor, America, help him?
Yeah, I think, yes, right now it needs a kind of economic and commercial cooperation from its north neighbor. But I think this relationship with its north neighbor is a kind of one of its economic linkages of Cuba. It has very multi linkages with the world, with China, Venezuela, and the EU. So it's developing a very diversified economic linkages. The United States is one of them. That's my idea.
But obviously, Americans getting closer to Cuba has sent a message to the rest of the world that Cuba is on a different direction. Europeans have been coming to knock on this door. China has been stepping up. So in that sense, it should be a good news for Cuban economy.
Well, you could see right away after the first steps were taken by President Obama last year, European companies did start to move. You could see the action that was going on, and I also think the other North American nations, Canada and Mexico, have interests, and Venezuela obviously has been the closest political ally of the Castros. I do think that the tone has made a difference right now. But in terms of American investment, first, it will not be a panacea. It will not solve all the problems of Cuba. Secondly, you have to have the embargo repealed by Congress before you can have widespread American investment.
From the executive branch, what President Obama can do to ease the restrictions on trade and personnel exchanges between the two?
Right. A lot would be person-to-person exchanges, but things like allowing commercial air flights between the two countries, allowing Cuban products to be brought directly into the United States legally for the first time. The reporters covering him can bring in Cuban cigars back to the United States with them legally for the first time. And so you're going to, there are little steps, but these are not the big steps. They're not partnerships in building hotels. They're not opening casinos or major plants, manufacturing plants.
On the ideological front, the Cuban government firmly believed that it would not allow President Obama or American government to try to influence how Cuban politics works. But do you think it is still on the agenda of President Obama to change the politics in Cuba in any way?
It was really interesting to listen. He handled it very gently. He brought up the issue of political prisoners, and Raul, this was the first time I saw in a question and answer either of the Castros talking about issue of political prisoners. But President Obama said it's up to the Cubans. This is an issue for the Cuban people to decide, and he combined Cuba and China and Vietnam as countries where the United States has some disagreements, but it's up to the people of those countries to reform, not up to the United States to dictate the terms to those countries.
What do you think? Is there any similarities in how Americans have been treating Cuba, China, Vietnam, in terms of meddling with the domestic politics?
Yeah, I think I have a different perspective. Right now, I think the United States will never give up its strategy. Its strategy is more like regime change. So right now it has a new policy. It's a kind of a policy shift because the U.S.-Cuban policy in the past 3 decades has been outdated. This policy is not working. It's a kind of Cold War thinking product. So right now the United States have to update its Cuban policy in order to meet with the reality. So I think it's a kind of new solution to the present problem, but it's not a strategic change.
Because Mr. Obama still mentioned human rights issues and how to handle dissent issues during the press conference.
Yeah.
That is still in American politicians' psyche, obviously.
Yes, I think the United States will never accept the Cuban Revolution. Will never accept the Cuban socialist system and this one-party political institution. And the Cuban human rights record is always criticized by the United States. So I think right now, yeah, it's true. There is a military destabilization from the United States, but I think deep inside, the United States is still has this hostile attitude toward Cuba.
All right. We're talking about U.S.-Cuba relations after President Obama landed in Havana 88 years after the last American president to do so. You're now watching Dialogue. Don't go away. We'll be right back. We're talking about U.S.-Cuba relations after President Obama's visit to Havana. Well, Rick, will this resetting, or should I say reestablishment of diplomatic ties with Cuba, change Americans' politics or international relations with Latin American countries? America has a very rocky relationship with Latin American countries, invaded several countries in Central America. It has rocky relations with Venezuela, Bolivia. Will this change everything?
It won't change everything, but it is a signal. Now, there are two issues. One is the follow-up, what happens next in the United States with President Obama, with American policy. But the second is who's the next president. If there's a Republican-elected president, you're likely to see everything rolled back that President Obama has done, and a much more ideological tone.
You think so?
I think that,
if there's a Republican
either of the leading Republicans, Ted Cruz, who is half Cuban American, or Donald Trump, would both be strongly anti-Castro. Hillary Clinton, it's an open question, but she probably would continue along the lines of what President Obama is doing. So for the rest of Latin America, I do believe that a Hillary Clinton presidency would be more like an Obama presidency, where it would be less about the Cold War and more about economic engagement, and if there's competition, it would be competition with China to see who can come in for partnerships.
But it seems that the American people, most of the American people, welcome the president reaching out to Cuban. It seems a lot of people agree.
Well, if you, in terms of polling, nearly 60% of Americans agree with ending the embargo, which is twice as many as those who oppose. But politically, the Republicans are absolutely against. The Republican Party and the candidates are absolutely against. And even in the Democratic Party, some of the loudest voices, the former Democratic chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee is against lifting the embargo.
But Mr. Wang just mentioned the demography in Florida, where most of the Cuban immigrants are. Their demography has changed. There are new immigration, and their view about Cuba has changed. Will that be a factor?
I think so. I think going ahead, I think it's inevitable. There is a new generation of Cuban Americans, and it's clear that they are different. They have a different view. But the problem is that we are in the present of very divided American politics. So I see where we're going to be in 10 years, but it could be a rocky time in 10 years if there is a change of power in the United States.
And we understand China has always been establishing and upgrading its economic relations with Cuba. China has been reaching out to Latin American countries. Last year, President Xi was attending a summit between China and Latin American countries. Will there be competition between America and China to win over influence and leverages in Latin America?
Yeah, to a certain degree, there is a kind of competition between China and the United States. But I think it's a kind of benign competition. It's based on those commerce, economic cooperation, instead of military competition. So right now, in the past decade, China and Latin America have witnessed such a rapid growth of bilateral trade. Right now, China is seeking to expand its investment in Latin America, and China is seeking to expand its production cooperation with regional countries. So I think China can be a very constructive force in this region to help those regional countries to promote their economic growth. China will give them technology, financial resources, and a big market. And China will find resources, natural resources, market, and very quality products in Latin America. So this cooperation between China and Latin America is very mutual beneficial, I think.
But since America has been reaching out to Latin American countries, it seems that President Obama will visit Argentina very soon. This time he was in Cuba. Do you think those Latin American countries will come to a stage where they have to pick an economic partner from China and America? Is there any calculation for them?
I don't think so. I don't think so. And right now, I think Latin America as a region is growing up. Its economy has developed very fastly in the past 5 decades. So right now, I think for the region, there is a kind of demand for diversifying its international economic linkages. It wants to have this cooperation with some traditional partners like United States, EU countries, and Japan. And right now, they also want to have some non-traditional partners like China and India. So I think this faster development between China and Latin America, this cooperation between China and Latin America, is a kind of demand from Latin America, I think.
And Rick, do you think when Mr. Obama decided to cozy up to Cuba, he has China on his mind?
I don't think it was only because of China or primarily because of China, but yes, that is a reason. He sees the 21st century as the Pacific century, looking from the United States Pacific coast to China and looking east. And I do believe that he sees that not only in the Pacific Rim, but in Latin America along the Pacific coast, that China is the partner, the competitor. I don't really think military rival as much, even though there have been some issues in the South China Sea. But I do think in South America and Latin America, there's an interesting dichotomy because China is moving in with a lot of infrastructure projects, the kinds of things that the United States has not been doing, while Americans have other kinds of economic interests. And so it's been possible so far for both countries to increase the trade and to have partnerships with Latin American countries without direct competition.
What are the different economic incentives for both China and America, if there's any?
Well, American companies tend to move in. A lot of it is not so much government.
Companies also.
Right, but it's less driven by the government. I think the Chinese government has a more coherent development strategy for economic development in Latin America than the American government. A lot of what's happening from the U.S. standpoint has been driven by companies that have moved forward and alliances of companies. While I think the Chinese offensive has been driven by a strategic plan.
And will the global economic gloom have any bearing on how U.S. and China should have its economic cooperation with Latin America, considering commodity prices have been going down? Brazil is in trouble. Will that have any impact on how China conducting business with Latin America?
Yeah, I think this right now the world has entered into a new cycle, new economic cycle. Right now, the commodity price is going down very quickly. So I think China's commercial and economic ties with Latin America is a little undermined by this new phenomenon. China, according to the last year data, the economic trade value between China and Latin America is decreasing. And some Latin American countries have fallen into economic recession. Their economy is really in danger. So China is worried there is investment in those countries. It's because those countries are really risky in financial terms. So I don't know, maybe China might seek cooperation from the United States to know how to handle those problems, because the United States is really experienced in handling those problems.
What do you think, Rick? The commodity price going down, should that be an opening for America maybe to expand presence in America?
It is an opening, but it's also a warning for China to try to get return in commodities and not in cash. I mean, to get oil from Venezuela instead of IOUs in RMB or dollars. And I mean, it's an opportunity both for the United States to move in, but also to have projects that actually could benefit everyone. That's sometimes difficult because we think in a world of competition, but there are possibilities out there. Commodities are going to be an issue over the next few years, and so China is going to have to shift its strategy a little bit.
Coming down to Cuba, this time Mr. Obama also brought many business leaders with him, maybe expand hotel businesses and tourism. Will that be making a lot of economic sense for Cuba?
For Cuba, definitely. When you think of what Cuba was like before the revolution and what you see the island now, it's a beautiful place. I mean, it has beautiful beaches. It is perfect for ecotourism. It was a tourist mecca. It was a gambling mecca for people from all over America on the East Coast before the end of the 1950s. And so there are many, many possibilities. Cuba has to decide what it would like. I mean, it has a lot of potential there, but it also has potential to completely change the nature of Cuba. So the Cuban government is going to have to decide how to pursue it, but there are many economic development opportunities related to tourism.
I heard a lot of Chinese businessmen investing in Cuba. There are still a lot of difficulties in getting access and getting permits from the government. Do you think this time around anything will change?
Yeah, I think so. The renewed U.S.-Cuban relationship will give another driving force to Cuba's economic reform, just pushing forward its economic reform process. I think the Cuban government has to take many more measures to improve its investment environment. So this improvement of investment environment will finally facilitate China's investment in the region, in this country.
So the momentum is there, but whether or not Obama's legacy will live on will probably depend on the election results of America.
That's right. It really all depends who wins in November.
All right. Thank you very much, Rick, and thank you, Mr. Wang. And you're now watching Dialogue on CCTV News. I'm Joe in Beijing. Thank you for joining us. Goodbye for now.